thank you. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I know that I'm standing between you and lunch, so I know it's a difficult moment, but we're going to share that together. So this is me, and if you see that picture in different supports, whether it's GitHub, whether it's different systems, there is a non-null chance this is also me. That picture has been following me for a while, and like the meerkat has been like the thing that follows me because I feel that it's the kind of animal that always looks around and figure out what's wrong around it and try to do something about it. And I kind of see myself in the same way. And what I'm going to talk about today, about addressing development pains holistically, before like starting to get into that directly, I want to talk about a movie first. So pretty sure you know that movie, like a lot of people know it. I know some people still haven't seen it. And it's actually the first movie that I bought on video cassette, like VHS, for the ones that are old enough to know about that. And it was my first VHS in French, because I'm French. And I still was hooked by that movie in the first place, and I was like, I need to buy it. I need to kind of figure out but I want to watch it again. I want to know what's happening in that movie, and I want to know everything about it. And there is that kind of famous scene in the movie, right? Where you're like, oh, are you going to take the blue pill or are you going to take the red pill? So basically, are you going to want to know what's happening behind the scene and want to understand what's behind, or do you want to stay in your little dream and just kind of enjoy your life? Basically, that's the thing. And as I was a kid, I was looking at this and I was like, well, of course I want to take the red pill. I want to learn Kung Fu, and I don't want to work for it. I want to learn everything. I want to know to hack computers. I want to know to do everything without having to ever work for it. So that seems pretty amazing, right? But then, as I got older and I started working in IT, there is that scene that kind of reflected with me a bit more about hey, you know, if you kind of looking what's behind, and sometimes it's just making your life harder. And sometimes it's very nice to just have the toolings and the systems that are just going to bring you to do the thing you want to do without having to work as much for it and just be enjoying the things that work well. And then there is that other TV show that I really like, The Office. And there is a cut scene of it, which if you're actually interested in it, you can find it on YouTube, where there is Jim that's playing a prank on Dwight. So two of the main characters, and he's trying to play a prank on him by making him think that he's actually in the Matrix and that he has a choice to take the blue or the red pill. And contrary to what Jim expected from Dwight, Dwight just decides to go for the blue pill and is like, well, you know what? I'm happy right now. I don't want to kind of risk it. This is really bad timing. Just I'm going to take the blue pill, I'm going to stay with it. And it's kind of that kind of thing that made me reflect a lot. And I was like, well, what do we do as developers, right? So as developers, we have kind of that same thing. And when we're joining small companies, we don't necessarily have all the toolings and all the systems that help us be more efficient at our work. We're generally going into an ecosystem where everybody has their own computer, their own environment, their own way of doing things. And this is great because it's nice to be flexible and to be able to just use the system that you used to use. But the reality of things is that when you kind of work in a company that has that tooling, it helps you a lot because you can be really efficient right away. You can go to the things that you wanted to do in the first place and start working on that. And that's something I realized when I was between jobs, because at the time, I was working with big tech companies, and there was all the toolings. I needed to go in a repository. I typed one command. I had all my environment set up. And I didn't have any more pain than that. But then I was in between job, and I started writing code, open source code, on my own computer, and I didn't have any environment. It's been years that I was just writing code on the work computer and have the environment and the setup for it, and it was great. But then I started getting in the situation where, wait, that thing I'm used to use is not there. It's not on my computer. So how do I install that thing already? And then depending on the tool, it's a different way to install it. It's a different system. Oh, I need that environment. I need that thing. I need that IDE and that connection with the IDE, and I need to install Golang, I need to install REST, I need to install whatever. Then I need to kind of like start going through the different aspects of my program, and I realized that there's a lot of toolings that I don't have, and most of the time it's like either painfully reading readmes and figuring out how to kind of like install something, or sometimes because I was lazy in the past and didn't fully write a readme, boo me, I just have to figure out what's missing, right? And so I go through it, I do like a try and fail, and I end up having my environment. But it was kind of like painful. Then there is like the weird situation when you write your code and you're like, wait, how do I write tests for that language? How do I kind of run the tests? How do I execute all the tests that I need to execute? And how do I go through all of my system? And finally, how do I publish that specific release that I want to publish? I have everything ready, but I don't remember what was the process for it. And then there is that other project in another repository that has a dependency on the same tool I'm using, but in a different version. And I'm like, how do I start managing that? So I start using different tooling that help me sort of switch versions, or I end up just installing the installing tooling. Not very easy. So this was basically what my computer was doing, looking at me, failing in all the ways, trying to figure out how to set up my environment. And I was like, yeah, definitely feel that I went out of the matrix right now, and I'm actually being like having to deal with all the things by myself. So I started deciding that I would want to write like a small tooling. I kind of based that in some of experience that I had before, but I was like, if I need a blue pill, I'm just gonna write my own blue pill. And I built a small tool that was like closed source just for me, very, very bad code. I didn't want to look at that after. But like a simple Ruby tool that was just installing dependencies for me just from a simple definition file. And I was like, this is great because now I can start solving some of my problems. And I started deciding that I would also like add basic local commands, so then whatever repository I would get in, I would type a command, and I would always do the result that I expect from it. So I could run test, I could build a release, I could run linting, I could do whatever just with the same command, no matter which repository I was running it from. And then after that, I joined Temporal. So Temporal, it's a company that's building a tool that's also called Temporal, that's fully open source, and that's the leading durable execution solution. So that means that what Temporal does is orchestration as code with the mindset of writing your code without ever being bothered by actually whatever can happen to your system, whether it crashes, whether it kind of like does a bunch of retries. You don't have to care as much about it because Temporal is going to help you care about that. And so I was looking at the tooling, I was looking at everything we're doing, but I was still sort of like struggling with the same kind of problems. Because in the infra teams of Temporal, we're building Temporal Cloud. So it's the same OSS version that you can use for free on your own, but we scale it and we deploy it for you. And that thing is pretty great because you don't have to care about a lot of things, but our internal teams still add different ways of working that made it not necessarily very easy for people to onboard in teams or to remember, depending on the repository I was going in, oh, am I running tests or am I doing something? Like, thankfully, most of our code base was in a single language, so that was helping things a bit, but we had makefiles that were helping doing a number of things, but that wasn't great because we have many servers in many clusters in many regions where we're doing different things in them, and most of the time it just led to have like many different things and different way of doing things. So at the time I joined the company, we were about like 40 plus engineers in the whole engineering area, and at this stage there was no standard. So as I said, some makefile but with different way of doing things, and something that developers love to do, shell aliases. So shell aliases are great when you're doing something for yourself, but as soon as you're doing something for sharing, what it led people to do is, oh, yeah, I have a runbook that's telling me how to deploy that thing or how to run that specific command, and then I go through the runbook and I just hit command not found everywhere. And I'm like, oh, what is that thing? Where is it coming from? Is that tooling I'm missing to install? Do I have to like build something? And I feel like, no, 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 that's that person that actually has an alias. You should ask them to give it to you. Like, okay. So I get the alias, and I try running the command with the alias, right? And then it fails halfway through, and I'm like, oh, what happened? It's like, oh, yeah, like I think that other person actually fixed the alias, but he has the version, so you need to ask them to give it to you. So I went to the other person, asked for the alias, and then that person also had another part that was breaking that the first person had fixed in their alias. So I ended up doing like kind of like surgery into the shell aliases of people to making things work for what I needed. And so I got to the point where it was like, this is not making sense that we're just filling it that way. So we had like a lot of things that were set up in our systems, but we didn't really have a proper way to use them. It's not that engineers weren't like taking the time to do it. There were runbooks, there were like commands, there were like a bunch of processes. People were writing aliases to try and make their life easier, but we weren't taking advantages of that as much as we should have. And so I kind of went back in my head and thought about, I built something for myself because I had some of those pains, but I was on my level. Can I just take this and make it broader? Kind of follow the same idea that temporal as a tool simplifies developers' lives because you don't have to care about a lot of the boilerplate things that you usually do in your code, but do it for developer tooling and make it so people that are actually trying to write stuff can just write their stuff. Someone that is like, oh, I need to fix something in that repository doesn't have to spend half a day figuring out how to install the dependencies so they can test their code and then push a release for fixing the system. And so I rewrite my tool and I open source it. It's now called Omni or omnipotent in terms of like that tooling as the idea of like doing a bunch of things for people. And it has a number of functionalities in terms of like entering repositories, navigating around the repositories, which simplifies locating stuff for people and providing commands that have dependencies on different repositories. It also supports installing dependencies in the repositories. So now we have basically different repositories that have like a file that defines the dependencies, and that tool is just gonna figure out where to get the dependencies, where to get the right version, install it in the environment, and making sure that it works for the people. And we have a bunch of commands that can be shared with that, either locally to a repository, so to solve the problem I was talking about when I was saying like, oh, do I run tests, or do I run builds, or do I like create release, but also to be able to kind of like have cross-system aliases, which are just basically commands that people can just script and share, and that are going to be updated between them. So that means that if someone fixes a problem that they're having, they're not only fixing that for themselves, they're fixing that for the whole company. And so I started working that out with a few colleagues. Initially, that was like written in Ruby, but the problem is like the ambition of the tool weren't fitting. So we really like went through it, and it was like, let's try dynamic environment. Let's try using stuff like DRenv or StratoEnv to kind of load an environment. And that wasn't working that well. So at that point, I decided to take a step back, and I rewrote the whole tool in Rust, which is way more efficient, unsurprisingly. And so once we had that tooling, the challenge was, how do I kind of like market that to my colleagues? How do I make sure that people actually feel that it's actually bringing something to the table and it's helping them in their job? And so the first thing I did was looking at the stuff that was really difficult for people. The thing that was really painful, that everybody was complaining about all the time, and that I was also complaining about. And the first one was accessing systems. So as I said, we have many servers in many regions, and the best way to kind of access the systems was to use a tooling that gives us just-in-time access. We're working with a company that's called Common Fate for that. And when we needed to access a system, we basically needed to call all of those commands one after the other. That means also that you basically try and access the system. Sometimes some of those commands, you don't have to repeat them because that cluster already existed. But sometimes the cluster is not known for you, so you need to grab all the information, pull them, figure out what's happening. And so I was like, that's not working. I don't like that. I don't like working like this. It's just wasting a lot of people's time. And there were also like a spread of aliases about, oh, do I get the config of that cluster and how do I start using it? And so we wrote a small tool behind Omni, which is just in this case, like a shell script. But that's shared through Omni, and that's kind of like working with the different clusters we have, where the clusters declare their own configuration into a Git repository. And that tool makes sure that the repository is always up to date for people, that they're pulling the right information locally, and once that cluster name is found, we can resolve automatically all the information to connect to it, and we just run all those steps for people without them having to run that, which led to replacing all of that mess by either 2 commands if I want to separately request access and then connect to the cluster, or even simply 1 command which is going to take care of requesting access for people. So that was the first use case that started kind of like building up the hype for using that tooling internally. And the second one was some of our internal tools. So there is like TCLD, which is basically the temporal cloud controller command, which is available open source too, and we use internally. And that command also had like kind of an issue with the fact that we keep updating our control plane in different versions, and there is sometimes version incompatibility. And so not only people needed to sometimes log in, but sometimes they try and use the command, and the version of the command they're using is actually not up to date. So it needs to rebuild the version of the tool so they can start using it. And this is like a fact of the fact that we're developing also the servers and the command internally. So there is like step function. We're being more careful with OSS. But for everything that is like internal, that was like pretty painful. And so same thing, we write some tooling internally to wrap the different environments that we were connecting to, hiding the notion of like, oh, for that environment, I need to connect to that address, and that other environment, that other address. And at the same time, hiding the fact that we needed to rebuild the system, because you just call the command. If a rebuild is needed, it's just going to be rebuilt. If like a login is needed, it's just going to log in for you, like at least opening the page for you to log in. So those kind of systems started kind of building up into the knowledge of Omni into the company, and then it was just a matter of asking developers, do you want to take the blue pill that we're offering you, or do you want to keep knowing everything that's happening behind the scene and dealing with it yourself? And unsurprisingly, a bunch of people started adopting the tool, and that created some kind of movement that ended up being pretty amazing. When people are convinced of a system, they want to invest more into it. And so the growth of the product ended up being like organic internally, where the more people started adopting the tool, the more they were writing comments for it to kind of share across the place and replace their internal shell aliases. The more comments were added, the more the tool was becoming useful internally, and the more the tool was becoming useful, the more people were adopting it. So it was just creating that natural chain. So developers started recommending each other to just use the tool when they were having trouble. When someone was coming and be like, oh, I cannot access that thing, that command is not working, like, just use the tool. It's just going to do it for you. And we started like working on automatically installing that on new developers' laptop. And now we are using Omni for a lot of our internal systems, for dependencies, for triggering temporal workflows internally, or even for onboarding people, where you can simply clone a repository through Omni, which is going to clone all of the environment they need to get to start working inside of the company. And so just wanted to kind of show a quick video. I could have done it as a demo, but I think video is going to be faster than me, where you can see here that we have like a sort of like an onboarding step for the tool when you start it the first time, and you can configure how you want to work with it. You have different commands that are provided through running help. And then you can go into any repository and set up the dependencies that you want to use. So those dependencies are going to be like explicit in YAML right now, where you define like the tools you want. If you want a specific version, you can specify the version you want. You can even specify, oh, I want to install that tool from a GitHub release in that specific version, which allows to really pin versions, which is something that was added pretty recently in the tool from more different teams. And you can run any custom command you want, which is allowing you to just do anything you want with the tool and have something that unifies anybody's environment. And then when you kind of like are in this repository initially, I don't have any of those tools that are installed, right? So they're not accessible. I cannot do anything. I cannot use that. But if I end up running that command, which is actually in this case asking me if I really want to run it because it's not in my trust directories, it's then going to take care of installing everything that needs to be installed for the system to be working. It's installing also every dependencies that is needed for building the right tools if there is build that is needed for that. So as we can see here, it's going through the goal length first. The other steps are going to be faster because all the dependencies are already installed. I think I can probably also accelerate that video slightly. I'm going to go 1.5. Oh, and it just cycled. So let's go back to the middle here, where basically here, sorry, going too fast. So if I go back to where I was, okay, so here we can see that, okay, embedded videos are not the greatest thing. So I'm going to get to the right place and I'm going to stop touching this. So once we have the different toolings that are installed, what we're going to see is that in the directory in which I didn't have access to anything, I will now have access to the different tooling that I just installed. And those are going to be available in the current directory, but they're not going to be available outside of the current directory, simply because then it allows you to have different environment with different setup, with different environment variables for the different setups that you have. So here you can see that when I went out, I actually lost the information, but when I went back in, I got back the tooling that I was installing. And here what we can see really quickly is adding a very basic command for the system where I can just run that command and it's going to do the thing that it's supposed to do. It's going to appear in the help also so people can easily find it. And that means that from that, I can start creating commands in different systems and share them across the place. So there's a bunch of other things that Omni is able to do, and there is active development on it because depending on the pains that the developers are feeling, we're kind of adding different systems, different toolings, different support in there. One of them that we added pretty recently is actually handling dependencies directly in GitHub Actions, which has been simplifying the fact that in the past we were handling dependencies for internal tools, but also using different GitHub Actions for setting up the environment on the workers. And so we added that to be able to just use it, use a single file defining dependencies, and use it everywhere. So Omni is fully open source also, so you can kind of go look at it, play with it, start contributing if you want. And I think that the last thing I'm going to end with here is that there are many different ways that we can go around developer productivity. There are many different subjects we can talk about for this. But one of the things that's very important is thinking about how do people work and how can we make things accessible in a way that's easy to use, but at the same time that let people keep using the environment that they are used to and that they like working in. So you have different ways to do that. At Temporal, we both use Omni and we use Temporal to do our internal stuff, which is pretty great in terms of the way it does things. So that's going to be all for me today. Thank you.